Ah, physics video. Yay.
Anyway, yeah, so I'm totally unprepared again, though. I did have notes, and I just don't know what I did with them, which is really irritating. Um, Lost them somewhere. So anyway, well, we'll just do without. Yeah, which is nonsense, garbage. Yeah, so now I'm just sorry. Um, it's just irritating because I had it sitting here, and it's just, you know. Anyway, um, so as two slit stuff, light, photons, the school of fish metaphor, kind of conversation. So you have conversation with people when you find they say something like, "What was the line I heard?" It's not a very good metaphor, and to me, it's a really great metaphor in the sense that you can visually see what happens in the school of fish. You can kind of see the dance that's taking place in the sense that to do one thing, they have to stop doing the other thing. The fish can't do more than one thing at once. They can't multitask. And so if you just take the fish metaphor and just add the component that they couldn't change their speed, and many schools of fish, it just sort of looks that way, like they're always moving. They don't stop. I guess that's the one thing fish don't do, right? They just don't stop. When they're schooling anyway. So you kind of get the idea that if the thing couldn't change its speed, all it has is changes in direction. And so then you just get this idea of patterns. And then you get the idea if they're doing a serious pattern, they're all circling each other, and they're all doing it at a constant speed. And then you oblige that circle to move in some direction, that this circle would have to be constructed more slowly. The metabolism of the circle would have to be compromised for any other movement that took place. Any other, not staying in one place, would be expensive. And then I would contend that that's the structure of the universe at its core. That's how it's working. It's the same kind of idea. That the photons are energy, and that all they're doing is transferring. They're moving from one place to another place. They still have their energy when they get to the new place. So it's like a fish leaving one school of fish, going to another school of fish, and now making that school of fish more capable of applying force because now it has more fish. And that's sort of what photons are doing as they move through the micro universe, the nuclear universe. And the direction is being controlled by this function, gravity, which is basically photons that we don't see. Photons of a wavelength we can't detect. So that's another key part of this is the wavelength argument, which gets back to the two-slit experiment and the other manifestations of this filtered pattern, the interference pattern. So there are, peculiarities. When you just think about the idea of what's happening in the two-slit experiment and questions you can ask about why certain things don't work. Why, you could almost argue that why are these exterior walls necessary to the function of this interference pattern? If the photons were really going through both slits and interfering with each other, it should only enhance the function by widening these slits. Instead of degrading it, they should enhance it. So it seems opposite, especially considering that the light source is always going to be angularly, there's going to be an angle for the light to get to these wider points. There's only one straight lined, and that's to the impediment, theoretically. And everything else is going to be an angled, what's the right word to use? It's going to be coming at a trajectory that wouldn't be, one would argue, that should, okay, no, I don't have the right words for it at this moment. but clearly it doesn't seem to indicate it would create any problem in terms of reaching both slits. You have this great deal of distance between the source usually and the slits, and in that distance there should be plenty of time to permeate whatever wave there was that you're permeating, and there's no reason why these waves couldn't be created in with wider slits, in a creating more relief, not less relief. So, the narrower you make the slits, the tighter you make an aperture, the more the light spreads out. So the wider concentrates the light, which seems backwards, right? So that's something to be explained outside of this idea of raw refraction rather than wave interference. If it were waves, there shouldn't be a wider interference pattern with narrower slits. I would think it would be the inverse, but I have to work that out mathematically. Anyway, what I was really thinking about was resonant frequencies and harmonics, and the fact that things tend to vibrate at these certain frequencies, and they'll do that as no matter what you put in terms of energy, they'll want to go to their native frequency, the one that fits the best. And I think that argument could be made that in the two-slit experiment, no matter what matter you're impacting, you are impacting it with all this extra light. And so it would be an interesting experiment to be able to somehow get rid of that extra light, somehow prevent it from hitting the material it's going to interact with, and thereby prevent it creating any kind of frequency here or here or here that could be creating what would be called the interference pattern in terms of its duplicating a harmonic that could be a half wavelength off or more, in terms of the vibrations being created in the material. Now, they say they do this one photon thing at a time, and that's the real experiment to play with, but yeah, it's really hard to find that one anywhere. It's been described as done, but it hasn't been shown to be done. But that would certainly, if you created a great deal of distance between the time you shoot photons, there wouldn't be any frequency problem, of course. It would always be recharging the system. And it might be interesting to see if there is any. I mean, certainly they would have time to do this, right? They could take a week to do the experiment. What's the big deal, right? No big deal. But I don't think it's been done that way. So it's one of the things on my list, to-do list. It's first to find one of these photon guns that can shoot one photon at a time, and somehow in something like a straight, pattern. Because that's the other problem here. You do have to have a consistent, coherent exposure to the light. And as I found with laser pointers, there's really a big problem in terms of the consistency of the light. It's not consistent. It has very bright spots and less bright spots, and it's partially polarized, which sort of degrades its usefulness in trying to do some experiments. Degrades it substantially. Anyway, I just think that harmonics might have something to do with this, just because the harmonics are built into the atoms themselves. The bigger the atoms, the slower they jiggle. The smaller the atoms, the faster they jiggle. These are just facts. And what's creating the noise is this infrared radiation, right? So we're talking about photons. Heat is always transmitted in the form of infrared radiation, which is photons. So it's photons going in, banging into the stuff, doing this transfer of energy, quote unquote, which might amount to this conversion of energy in the sense that you get back to the energy levels of the electrons, which is sort of another interesting subject, right? Because we have these locked orbits as they're described. I don't think we know for sure that this is the pattern they would take. I think they could also take a pattern where you have the orbit and then you have the wider orbits are actually connected to the inner orbits. So the orbitals will be more like this kind of thing, rather than crowded orbits where there's more than one electron in the same, and especially in very dense material, the fourth orbit has 192 electrons in it or something. Anyway, a lot of them. Where I think this kind of idea might make it more realistic. But then you have to talk about this energy level. What you're really talking about is the fact that when there is a change, when an electron loses a photon, that it changes what's called its energy. But what's really changed is its mass, in a way, or its electrical potential. It's not as let's see what's the right word to use. Well, I mean, a mass change, you would argue, would make it more gravitationally impactable from the perspective in the sense that it's going to take more. If it can't change its speed, the only thing it can change, the only thing that can change, if it can't acquire velocity, is position, so density. So it's going to, yes, it's going to become more more likely to be have to establish a different balance. Okay, yeah, see, it's not as articulate as I like to be, which is sort of irritating also. So we have a great deal of, as they theorize anyway, there's this huge amount of distance between the tiny little proton in the nucleus and the electron. It's way, 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 way over there. I mean, it's a huge amount of distance relative to their sizes. My argument is that it's gravity that's maintaining this shape of everything. Everything is being controlled by gravity. And so in this sense, the gravity is electricity and magnetism, but it's very strong electricity and magnetism because the power, the weight of the gravity is much heavier on these tiny, tiny particles. The size of the photons, the gravitons, is substantially huge by comparison to the size of these little tiny particles. And again, that the attraction and repulsion is being created by the same kind of shadowing force, the same kind of shadowing effect, and that there's just a balance between the attraction between the proton and the electron, and the repulsion between the electron and the neutron. So the neutron's really not the neutron. I mean, theoretically, you can say the electron's the neutron, and that it has a polarization relative to both of those things. There's probably some better way to describe that. It's like one is half positive, one is full positive, and one is zero. So you have to kind of think of it as, that kind of a level thing. So the two things are still attractive to each other from both sides, but their real attraction is from the two that are furthest apart. So you could say that the attractive force between the proton and the electron is neutralized by a repulsive force between the neutron and the electron. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so that's what's creating these energy levels. But the energy levels themselves are just a reflection of mass. So let's say if an electron, it seems to me that if an electron gives up a piece of itself, releases a photon, that in doing that, it's now more likely, or it has to, or it loses something, and that something it loses is its repulsive force to the neutron, and therefore is more affected by the attractive force with the proton. In effect, what I'm saying is as it loses photons, as it loses mass, so to speak, it's more affected by gravity in the sense that when it gets hit, that impact is more of an impact in terms of migrating it to a different energy level where it maintains a field. So again, you can just argue this is just like the field lines where there's a balance between two of dipole. So you're saying that the nucleus is basically a dipole, and it's creating field lines, and the field lines are the orbitals of the electron. So the field lines are basically just defining the orbitals of the electron. So in the same way, there's a place where you're at a neutral point where both the proton and the neutron have equal effect on you, and that's the orbit that the electrons will go to. Just like when you take a bunch of iron filings and shake them over a magnet, they'll line up on those field lines, even though they tend to want to be pushed into the magnet. The paper's essentially stopping them, but they'll line up because it's a neutral location. It's neutral to whatever position you're holding the paper at, I guess is the way to say that. They don't have any desire to move. They've done all the moving they need to do by any force other than the force, obviously, where they still want to go to the magnet itself. So they're still being forced to stay in that location. Yeah, and so, yeah, that's probably enough of that explanation. Alright, so, yeah, so this gets back to harmonics again, too, just this idea that there is these established field lines, and you can almost argue that what you're seeing in the two-slit experiment is a representation of the field lines. That's why you're getting a bar pattern. It's a simple bar pattern mathematically. It's not complicated. I mean, there's the maxima and the secondary maxima and the tertiary, and everything reduces proportionally, and the distances are all consistent, and so it's very representative. If I could take a magnet and say use some sort of light diffracting material on the field lines, you might end up with a similar pattern as just a shadow coming off of it. It would represent the same proportions. So the fact that it's proportionally the same as a wave function, which probably can be described as some similar mechanism in terms of understanding it as the tension between the water molecules, is what's basically forcing the creation of the waves. The frequency of the waves is based on the density of the material waving and the amount of tension in that material. Yeah. So where else did I want to go? So anyway, back to the school of fish thing. So the argument is that all this stuff is already moving the speed of light. So these electrons, however they're arranged, what's inside of them is likewise is the same. It's the same circumstance. There's enough gravity affecting them individually to force them together. So they're just obliged to orbit in a pattern. And the proton would be the same thing, the neutron would be the same thing. And these are just made out of photons. So when they're releasing a photon, they're just, what's happening is a piece of them, some of this plasma, some of this stuff swirling like a school of fish, some of the fish go off in a new direction. And there's probably rules for how that takes place. And I'm going to argue, or I have argued, that whenever light is released, it's released as two photons. I mean, to have a visible or a recordable, a noticeable piece of light, it has to come in this two thing. You have to know what its frequency is, and it can only have a frequency, you know, if there's a frequency between their occurrences. And so if infrared light was in this much time, this distance, ultraviolet would be, you know, twice as many photons in the same distance. That would be the difference between them, is the halving of the wavelength between them. So one can argue that if an electron jumps from the outer ring to the inner ring, it's going to release more energy, and it's going to release it at a higher frequency. But the trick is it's going to release, it's not that the photons themselves will have more power or more intensity, it's just that there's more of them for a given unit of time. So more of them get released when it travels a longer distance. So the longer distance to go from the outer ring to the inner ring creates the smaller wavelength because it's releasing more photons. Yeah, and likely to get to, from the outer ring to the inner ring, the force that caused that to happen would likely be a greater force. So if it actually did jump from the outer ring to the inner ring, if it was actually pushed by a force, and the force could be another atom hitting it, and another atom moving, and also with its orbiting electrons, influencing it with a pressure change in terms of the gravity and the electrodynamics, which really would all have to be calculated out, which have got to be very complicated. But let's just say it's because of the movement of the atom, the combined movement of the electron, the inner movement of the photons inside of the electron. I'm just saying it's a combination. Depending on how two things interact, the velocity of the impact is increased depending on the timing of the interaction. So depending on how these two spinning wheels interact with each other, say if this one's spinning this way and this one's spinning this way, if they bump into each other at a certain moment, nothing happens. If they bump into each other a certain moment later, these two hooks end up going inside of each other and they end up swirling right inside of each other. I'm not saying this matter does that. I'm just saying that timing is very important to how much energy would be in an impact. And what seems to me to be consistent with the overall theory would be that, yes, what's really happening is if an electron returns to a lower energy level, it releases a certain number of photons based on the amount of time. The time is what's dictating the frequency of the light released. So it takes less time. It's moving with a slower velocity when it goes from this ring to this ring. But when it goes from the outer ring to the inner ring, to be pushed that far, it has to be impacted at a quicker velocity, so it actually moves much quicker. And it's the quickness of that movement that creates the higher frequency of the photons it creates. So it's really a consequence of the speed of the transition from one location to another location that's dictating how quickly the photons are released. Maybe that's the way to say it. But anyway, I mean, it would account for the non-intuitive, kind of backward kind of fact that the higher frequency photons are released when you move the greater distance. I mean, intuitively you might think that if you go the greater distance, that would create the photons with the wider wavelength rather than the greater distance releasing photons of a tighter frequency. So anyway, it's just part of the overall picture. But I still want to get back to the real point of the school of fish analogy, is that all of this stuff has already built into it its energy. So all you're doing is transferring energy. Everything just transfers fish in the form of photons. And fish can also interact with each other and change direction. So if what we see as an energy transfer is that fish actually goes into something and stays in it for a while. So it increases its potential energy because now it gains a fish. But if the fish just goes in, interacts, and leaves in a new direction, I've pointed this out before, that's really what's taking place most of the time with gravity, is that the photon comes in, and all it does is change the direction of a photon in me, in one of my electrons, or somewhere in me. And so the graviton leaves in a new direction. My photon changes its direction inside of it, the matter it's in, and it collectively, over zillions of these interactions, there's a tendency to just cause the thing to be pointing in a new direction overall, depending on how many of these fish come in and change the direction. So again, it's this argument that if the fish are swimming in some kind of circular spinning pattern in a loop like this, and a bunch of other little fish keep coming in at this direction, they will slowly but surely wipe out any pattern that exists here by getting reflected out and starting to bend all of these things into a straighter line over time. And that's how you acquire velocity. You don't have velocity in any other way except some portion of your fish that are now swirling. It's like my hand, when my hand moves, what's happening on the, again, we have to understand the speed of light is 160 miles a second, 160,000 miles a second, 168,000 miles a second. So there's a huge amount of stuff happening in this very slow world of my hand moving. Many centuries went by for the photons. But what's really happening when my hand moves is that a bunch of the photons that my hand's made out of, inside of the atoms and inside of the electrons and inside of the protons, inside of the neutrons, all of those things got nudged, are nudging in a direction. They're moving the hand. The hand's not moving them. They're moving the hand. And that's where the transfer comes from. Their speed of light direction, instead of doing the circular thing, they were doing the circular thing in a direction. They tap dance in this direction, while they're juggling. Probably not, that's not a good analogy, just because you can keep juggling at the same speed even though you're tap dancing. So that's not that, tap dancing and then moving in a direction. So they're tap dancing slower, moving around the nucleuses and doing all this stuff inside the atom slower. The metabolism of the atoms changes, so the photons that make up the atom can spend more time moving. And that's key to the idea of time dilation. So then the time dilation is being created by that movement. So time slows down as velocity increases, just logically. If the school of fish has a pattern, and I make the school of fish move, and the fish can't change their speed, they're going to have to do the pattern slower to be able to move in some new direction. And velocity would be absolute by this theory, so the whole theory of relativity is forget about that. But forget about the whole, like I said, I sort of have to, all of the Einstein stuff is wrong. The gravitational lensing, I think, is really a byproduct of the density of ions around any gravitational body, any piece of matter. There's ions around my hand. There's ions created by everything. I saw some interesting videos about candle flames, and it was quite interesting. you don't really realize how many ions are created. And the fact that when you put charged plates between a flame, the flame will actually, the positive and negative ions will actually go in separate directions to the positive and negative poles, and that you can actually create electrical discharge over a wide gap by traveling through these heavy ions. So just like lightning, the more ions you get in the atmosphere, the more electricity that can travel through it, and it's more conductive, and you can have a very wide, the electrical potential can be very large, and a lower electrical potential can create a wider spark. What's the word for that? The breakdown distance is changed because of the density of the ions that are essentially creating a bunch of different conductors in between the two charges, and so really the spark is just jumping from conductor to conductor to conductor, and so it chains through the ions. But that's a whole other subject. Yeah. And again, that's all gravity. And it's all a form of gravity creating that electrical and magnetic effect through polarization. So it's just that the photons have been polarized, and different configurations, electron versus proton, whatever that means, spinning right, spinning left, whatever the difference would be. They are more transparent and more opaque to the different polarizations. And that's just it. So the one thing produces gravitons converts gravitons to a certain polarization that the other thing is either more dense to, is impacted, more likely impacts, or is transparent to, where it's more likely to go through it without changing its direction, without creating a directional change in its interior structure. Alright. It's not exactly what I wanted to get to. Anyway, so the subject of this physics stuff will be in the next Vlogerdome, the TV show. So I will have to try to put together another hour-long kind of thing where I just try to go from beginning to end and try to explain why I think this material theory of reality is more sensible, more consistent with the experimental, the volume of experimental evidence, and that phenomenon like the two-slit experiment, while interesting, I don't think are beyond material explanation, and we don't need to rely on a wave theory invented just to explain these nuanced experiments, and a wave theory that doesn't do you much good at all in understanding exactly how light interacts with electrons and how photons define energy, especially when you get to the electric and magnetic component of light, which is, I think, entirely made up. I don't think they have any such component. They have polarization, which in gravitons, in photons without frequency, does manifest as electricity and magnetism. But I've already been over that. Yeah, so anyway, do better next time, hopefully, when I find my notes. This page really looks like it should have had them on here somewhere, but they're not here. So anyway, yeah, I think there was something else I wanted to get to. It's kind of sort of pissing me off. Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, but yeah, I have to do more on this harmonic thing, because I think that's all part of this, and the fact that vibration, it's almost like the argument with the layers of glass, Newton's glass, and the idea that atoms would probably have a shape, and as you make their container smaller, they have to change their orientation to each other as the container becomes smaller. So, if somebody was standing on my shoulders and we were inside a box and you made the box smaller, then somebody'd have to hunch over, and eventually we couldn't stand on top of each other. We'd have to stand next to each other. There'd be a point where we couldn't do it one way. We'd have to do it the other way. We'd have to bend sideways. And I think the same thing happens to atoms as you change the size of their container. And that is the same thing as why there's a preferential frequency, is that there's an arrangement of matter and atoms and the tension between the atoms where they bounce off of each other in such a manner as the reflected sound has the same wavelength as the sound that went through them, and because it's the same, but obviously now an echo, the echo is essentially at the same harmonic, so it only complements. It's a constructive interference rather than a destructive interference. So the harmonics are basically those frequencies where the echo, the reflection, is on the same, has the same period, just a different, what's the word, cycle. The cycle is different, but it's the same period. The wavelengths are lined up. They're not off-center, so they're constructive rather than destructive interference. And that's why the harmonics resonate at a higher amplitude, is because it's basically they're all combining the echoes. They're maximizing the dominant echo frequencies that are consistent with the original frequency. Yeah, that's probably a better way to say it. Anyway, it's very, I think there's somewhere to go there. So, I haven't said I tied it together, but I'm just saying it is an interesting phenomenon, and harmonics, I think, does deal a lot with constructive and destructive interference. So it will get to the nut of it, so to speak. So anyway, enough. Sorry. Wish this was a better video, but it's got stuff in it. It's good enough. Until next time.